I'd just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event.
Princess Anne had spent years being called severe, difficult, and impossible to soften. But when the newly released Windsor Records were placed on the table, the room changed forever. Every warning she had given, every uncomfortable objection she had raised, every silence she had refused to obey, was suddenly confirmed in black and white. And for the first time, the monarchy had to face the truth Anne had carried alone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne sat in a quiet Windsor room with the folder before her, and even her composure could not hide the weight of what she was reading. The Windsor Records, meaning a newly released set of palace meeting notes, household access logs, and private correspondence, did not simply mention her concerns. They confirmed them. Page after page showed that she had warned about internal royal decision-making, private access, and household influence long before anyone wanted to admit there was a problem. That mattered because these were not harmless details. Decisions inside a royal household shape who enters private rooms, who influences sensitive choices, and who quietly gains power. Charles took the same file later and said nothing. The king had heard Anne speak sharply before, but this was different because the papers did not attack his sister. They defended her. They showed that Anne had not been driven by bitterness, jealousy, or family tension. She had been responding to a documented breach of royal protocol, a phrase that means the accepted rules and customs that keep royal duties, access, and authority in order. When Charles reached the memo that named the breach, his hand stopped moving. He set the page down, and the silence around him became more painful than any argument Anne could have made. Anne read one page twice. She closed the folder slowly, as if the sound itself had to be controlled, and the slight tremor in her face said what her voice never would. Vindication had arrived, but it had not arrived gently. It carried years of being dismissed by aides, who softened her warnings, reduced her concerns, and treated her discipline as disruption. A second document made the wound deeper. It showed private evidence had supported her concerns at the time, yet senior palace aides still pushed her aside. The record had changed everything. Anne was no longer the difficult voice in the room. She was the warning the monarchy ignored. But before the records could shake the monarchy, the people at the center of the storm had to face what Anne's vindication meant for each of them personally. This was never just about papers, signatures, or sealed palace files. It was about people who had lived behind polished doors, while one woman carried a warning no one wanted to hear. Anne's vindication did not arrive gently. It arrived like a judgment, forcing Charles, Camilla, William, and Catherine to confront the cost of ignoring the one royal who had refused to flatter the room. Anne had always understood the price of honesty. She had spent a lifetime choosing duty over comfort, even when that duty made her seem severe to those who preferred softer words and easier silences. To Anne, loyalty was not smiling through danger. Loyalty was speaking before damage became tradition. That was why the newly confirmed records struck so deeply. They did not create her reputation. They corrected it. They showed that behind every blunt warning was a woman trying to protect the crown from weakness, dressed up as peace. Charles felt that truth with a force he could not escape. The king read the confirmation memo alone, and the longer he looked at the page, the heavier the room seemed to become. Charles removed his glasses, set them beside the file, and stayed motionless, as if one sentence had reached across the years and placed every ignored warning back in front of him. He was not only facing a palace error, he was facing a family wound. Anne had spoken as his sister, but she had also spoken as one of the monarchy's fiercest guardians, and he had allowed her words to be treated like an inconvenience. Camilla felt the change before anyone said it openly. The queen consort knew the records revived the most dangerous questions inside royal walls. Who had influence? Who had access? And where private wishes ended before royal duty began. Camilla did not need to be accused to feel exposed. The file itself carried enough force. It brought back old discomfort, old whispers, and old choices that now looked far less harmless than they had once seemed. William studied the same documents with a different kind of fear. The prince saw not only what Anne had warned against, but what those warnings had saved. The future king understood that a monarchy does not fall only through public scandal. Sometimes, it weakens through private exceptions, through small permissions, through the quiet habit of ignoring the person brave enough to object. Catherine understood it too. She saw that Anne's resistance had never been coldness. It had been a shield around the institution, around the younger generation, and around the future they would one day inherit. By the time each of them absorbed the truth, Windsor no longer felt like a place of protection. It felt like a place waiting for confrontation. Anne's vindication had entered every room, touched every relationship, and exposed every silence that had once seemed safe. And the deeper they looked into Anne's warnings, the clearer it became that one forgotten moment had started the entire chain of consequences. Every royal crisis has a moment that later feels impossible to ignore. For Anne, that moment came during a private Windsor memorial rehearsal, when a change was made so quietly that most people in the room barely noticed it. But Anne noticed. She saw who stepped forward, who hesitated, who allowed it, and who looked away. That single ceremony became the trigger she never forgot. Anne understood instantly that the change was not small. The Windsor Memorial Rehearsal incident, as the records would later identify it, centered on a private seating and access arrangement being altered without her approval or proper household review. A memorial rehearsal is meant to prepare the family for a formal remembrance event, where order matters because every placement carries meaning. Access arrangements decide who is allowed close to private royal spaces, and for Anne, that was the line no one should cross casually. What others treated as a simple adjustment felt to her like the first crack in a much larger wall. Charles sensed her concern before she fully spoke it, but the king did not want another confrontation. He wanted calm. He wanted the family to get through the moment without another wound opening in public. But Anne had never trusted calm that depended on pretending not to see danger. She stepped aside with him and warned that small exceptions do not remain small inside a palace. They become habits. Then they become expectations. And once expectations settle, even a monarch can struggle to pull them back. Charles pushed against her warning because he believed the family needed softness after years of strain. Anne heard the pain beneath his words, but she also heard the risk. She told him that peace built on avoidance never lasts, and that a royal household cannot survive if personal comfort is allowed to bend rules meant to protect the crown. That was the moment her warning became more than a sister's frustration. It became a formal objection, spoken clearly before the damage could be hidden behind polite language. The records later proved exactly that. Anne's concern was entered into a private note that same day, confirming that she had warned the palace immediately after the rehearsal change. The discovery mattered because it destroyed the old version of events. She had not waited. She had not exaggerated afterward. She had seen the danger at once and moved to stop it before it hardened into precedent. Yet the same file revealed something colder. Her words had been softened in later summaries, turning a sharp but measured warning into something that made her appear harsh, difficult, almost unreasonable. Anne had carried that distortion for years. Charles had allowed the softened version to survive. Camilla had benefited from a silence no one wanted to name. William and Catherine, looking back, could now see how one altered arrangement had pulled the future into the past's unfinished fight. Once the Windsor Memorial Rehearsal incident resurfaced, the palace could no longer pretend Anne's warnings were emotional exaggerations. That buried rehearsal note turned private discomfort into open conflict, and soon, Anne would have to face the very people who had dismissed her. When Anne finally entered the room, the silence did not feel respectful. It felt guilty. Charles sat at the head of the table. Camilla remained still beside him, and William watched carefully from across the room. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The records had already spoken louder than anyone there could bear. Anne carried the file like something heavier than paper. The meeting had been called inside a private Windsor sitting room, away from advisors, away from carefully prepared statements, away from the palace habit of turning pain into polished phrases. That mattered because aides had shaped the language for too long. They had softened warnings, buried discomfort, and turned duty into disagreement. Now only the family remained: Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and the woman whose warnings had returned with proof behind them. Charles knew the moment could not be controlled. The king had faced hard conversations before, but this one cut differently, because Anne was not challenging his crown. She was confronting his judgment. She placed the file on the table and looked at him with the kind of calm that felt more dangerous than anger. Then she said she had never wanted to be right. She had wanted to be listened to. Those words struck harder than accusation, because they carried years of restraint, years of swallowed frustration, and years of loyalty that had been mistaken for defiance. Charles looked wounded because Anne's statement exposed two failures at once. The palace had failed to protect its own rules, but he had failed to trust his sister when her warning should have mattered most. He tried to answer, yet the words did not come easily. The monarch could defend procedure, timing, pressure, and family strain. The brother could not defend the silence. Anne had spoken early. She had spoken clearly. And the newly released records proved that others had heard her and still allowed her to stand alone. Camilla finally broke the tension with a question that made the room colder. She asked whether the records were now being used to punish her. Anne did not move toward cruelty. She did not soften into comfort either. She answered that the papers punished no one. They only revealed what choices had already created. Camilla absorbed the reply without protest, but the weight of it settled around her. The queen consort understood that influence did not need a public scandal to become dangerous. Sometimes it became dangerous when no one dared name it. William watched the exchange until he could no longer remain silent. The prince spoke carefully, but his message was sharp. The future monarchy could not survive if uncomfortable warnings were buried just to protect peace in the present. Catherine stayed quiet beside him, yet her stillness carried its own force. She knew this was not only about Anne's past, it was about the kind of crown the next generation would inherit. The confrontation ended when Charles pushed back his chair, not in fury, not in rejection, in defeat. The sound carried through the room like an admission no one wanted to say aloud. Anne had not broken the family by speaking. The silence had done that long before she arrived. Yet the true shock was not Anne's anger. It was the discovery of who had held power behind the decisions she warned against. Power inside the monarchy rarely announces itself. It moves through appointments, schedules, access lists, seating plans, and signatures that seem harmless until they reshape everything. Anne understood that long before the records proved it. She had seen how influence could enter quietly, how hesitation could become permission, and how one ignored warning could become a palace habit. Anne had never feared authority when authority was honest. What disturbed her was something quieter. Decisions being shaped before they were formally approved, private access being treated like a favor, and household influence moving through side doors instead of proper channels. The record showed exactly why her concern mattered. Access control meant deciding who could enter sensitive royal spaces, and private household influence meant the power held by trusted staff or family circles away from public view. When those lines blurred, the crown did not look flexible. It looked vulnerable. A senior courtier discovered that truth with a force that left him pale. He read the access logs, then turned to his own archived notes, and realized the most uncomfortable fact of all. Anne's disputed warnings had not been dramatic complaints. They were supported by records already sitting inside the palace system. He had seen pieces of the pattern before, yet he had allowed them to be treated as routine. That realization mattered because palace machinery depends on memory. When memory is edited, responsibility disappears. And when responsibility disappears, power moves without a name. Camilla felt the machinery closing around her after the meeting ended. The queen consort sat alone, gripping the edge of a chair, not because one record had destroyed her, but because several records had made her position feel suddenly fragile. She understood that influence could be defended when it remained vague. It became harder to defend when logs, notes, and delayed requests began forming a timeline. What once looked like personal adjustment now looked like a pattern others had been too careful to challenge. Anne's old request made the pattern even sharper. One file showed that after the Windsor Memorial rehearsal incident, she had asked for a written review of private access, but that request was delayed. A written review mattered, because it would have forced the palace to record who had permission, who granted it, and why. Delay protected comfort. Delay protected silence. Delay allowed exceptions to harden into practice. William's name changed the entire weight of the discovery. Another record confirmed that the prince later raised a similar concern, proving Anne had not stood alone, even if she had stood first. He saw what she had seen. He feared what she had feared. And once the machinery of influence was exposed, the palace could no longer contain the fallout inside private rooms. And as the first consequences began to fall, one reaction made it clear that the monarchy had entered a new reality. The fallout began not with a public speech, but with a door closing inside Windsor. It was a small sound, almost ordinary, yet everyone nearby understood what it meant. A privilege had ended. A pattern had been broken. And for the first time in years, the palace acted not to protect comfort, but to correct the record. Anne felt the shift before anyone dared call it justice. Following the release of the records, a private review began inside the palace, and its purpose was impossible to miss. Access permissions, household roles, and informal arrangements she had questioned were no longer being treated as awkward family matters. They were being examined as risks. That mattered because access was never just about entering a room. It meant proximity to sensitive conversations, private decisions, and the quiet machinery that shaped royal life before the public ever saw the result. Camilla received the notice with a stillness that revealed more than anger could have. The Queen Consort learned that certain private household access arrangements would be reviewed immediately, and her expression tightened as the words settled in. No one had accused her in public. No grand scandal had been announced. But inside Windsor, the message was unmistakable. Anne's warnings had moved from uncomfortable memory to official guidance, and the palace was now acting on the very concerns it had once softened, delayed, and pushed aside. Charles struggled with the decision because correction carried its own confession. The king knew the review was necessary, but he also knew what it said about the past. To fix the system now was to admit that Anne had been isolated when she should have been supported. To tighten boundaries now was to admit those boundaries had weakened under his watch. Charles was not only adjusting palace procedure, he was facing the painful truth that his sister had paid the emotional price for a failure the institution should have owned from the beginning. William supported the review with a colder kind of clarity. The prince did not see it as punishment, he saw it as protection. He understood that the future monarchy could not inherit blurred lines, private exceptions, and silent habits that everyone feared to challenge. Catherine understood the cost as well. She found Anne in a quiet moment and told her that the truth had arrived late, but not too late to matter. Anne did not break. She did not collapse into relief, but something in her face changed, just enough to show that the words had reached a place even discipline could not fully guard. The first door had closed, and the sound carried through every private corridor of the monarchy. Anne had been vindicated, Camilla had been checked, William had drawn a boundary, and Charles had begun the difficult work of undoing what silence had allowed. But procedure could only go so far, because beyond records, reviews, and royal protocol, the deepest wound was still waiting between a brother and a sister. There were no aides in the room this time, no prepared language, no polished palace phrasing, only Charles and Anne, seated across from each other with years of silence between them. For all the public weight of crowns and titles, this was suddenly a family reckoning. Anne had been vindicated by records, but what she needed now was something colder documents could never give her. Charles had asked for the meeting after the internal review began, and the request itself carried a confession. The king no longer wanted the conversation filtered through advisors, softened by officials, or protected by palace language. Advisors are the private staff who shape royal schedules, messages, and decisions. And for years, their presence had turned hard truths into careful phrases. This time, Charles knew careful phrases would only deepen the wound. Anne did not need another explanation. She needed him to face what had happened without anyone standing between them. Anne arrived with the same control that had always made others underestimate her pain. She did not demand apology. She did not perform victory. She sat across from her brother and allowed the silence to do what the records had done, expose what everyone had avoided. Charles looked at her and finally admitted what the palace had taken too long to understand. He had mistaken her warnings for resistance when they were actually protection. The words landed heavily because they did not sound like strategy. They sounded like regret. Anne listened without interrupting, but something in her posture changed when Charles spoke as a brother rather than a monarch. She told him the hardest part had not been being opposed, it had been being ignored. That truth cut deeper than anger, because it revealed the cost she had carried privately. Anne had stood firm while others called her difficult. She had warned them while they treated her caution as conflict. And through it all, she had protected an institution that had not protected her voice when it mattered most. Charles then revealed the decision that changed the emotional weight of the room. He had ordered Anne's original warning notes to be restored to the official internal record without softened language. The official internal record means the palace's formal archive of decisions, warnings, and written accounts used to preserve what truly happened. For Anne, that correction mattered because it returned her words to history as she had spoken them, not as others had reshaped them for comfort. Anne accepted the correction, but she did not let the moment become easy. She made clear that vindication meant nothing if the monarchy only listened after damage had already been done. Charles understood. The king had corrected the file, but the brothers still had to live with the silence that made correction necessary. Their quiet reconciliation did not erase the pain, but it shifted the balance inside Windsor. Anne had finally been heard. Charles had finally listened. And that fragile peace came just as the palace prepared for something far louder. And when the story finally broke beyond Windsor's walls, the world saw Anne not as difficult, but as the royal who had been right all along. By morning, Anne's vindication no longer belonged to Windsor. It belonged to the country. The story moved from private files to public judgment, and Britain watched the monarchy through a new lens. The woman once described as unyielding was suddenly being recast as the one person strong enough to say what everyone else avoided. Anne did not chase the attention. She had never needed applause to believe in duty, and that made the reaction feel even more powerful. Major broadcasters framed the newly released records as proof that her warnings had been grounded in service, not hostility. That mattered because public memory can be cruel inside royal stories. It can turn discipline into coldness, caution into bitterness, and honesty into rebellion. But this time, the narrative shifted. The same firmness once used against Anne now became the reason people trusted her. Palace officials moved carefully, issuing a restrained statement that acknowledged the importance of accurate records and proper internal procedure. Proper procedure means the formal steps used to make sure royal decisions are recorded, approved, and preserved honestly. The statement did not name every wound. It did not confess every failure. But it confirmed enough. The palace was no longer dismissing the issue as a family disagreement. It was admitting, in its controlled way, that records matter, because records decide how truth survives power. Anne saw the coverage only briefly. She listened long enough to hear her name spoken with respect, then turned the television off before praise could become uncomfortable. Yet even in that controlled silence, relief crossed her face. Not joy, not victory, relief. For years, she had stood in the hard place between loyalty and loneliness. Now the country was beginning to understand that she had not been trying to wound the monarchy. She had been trying to prevent it from wounding itself. William watched the same coverage with Catherine, and the prince understood the deeper meaning immediately. He said quietly that history might remember Anne more fairly now. Catherine heard the weight in his voice, because this was not only about the past, it was about the future they would inherit. If Anne could be ignored for telling the truth, then anyone could be. If her warnings could be softened, then any uncomfortable truth could be rewritten. One London newspaper captured the national mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page showed Anne in a navy coat beneath the headline, "Anne was right." Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered near the gates with flowers and handwritten signs thanking her for standing firm. The moment felt almost impossible. A royal once judged for being severe was now being honored for being steady. The public had delivered its response, but applause could not be the final answer. Anne's vindication had moved from private pain to national recognition. Yet the monarchy still had to decide what lesson it would take from the shock. As the noise faded and the verdict settled, Anne's vindication became more than a personal victory. It became a defining royal lesson. In the end, Princess Anne did not need triumph. She did not need applause, revenge, or a public display of victory. Her vindication came in a quieter form. The record corrected, the warnings confirmed, and the family forced to admit that the hardest voice in the room had also been the most loyal. The monarchy survived the shock, but it did not emerge unchanged. Anne had endured the weight of being misunderstood, yet she did not carry herself like someone waiting to celebrate. The records had permanently changed how her warnings were understood, turning what once looked like disruption into documented acts of protection. That mattered, because history inside the royal household is shaped by what gets preserved, what gets softened, and what gets quietly pushed aside. A record is not just paper. It is the memory of an institution, and this corrected memory now showed Anne as the royal who had tried to protect the crown before the danger became impossible to deny. Charles understood the cost of that correction. The king personally acknowledged Anne's role in protecting the crown, meaning the monarchy itself, the symbolic authority and duty carried by the sovereign and the royal family. His words did not erase the years she had spent unheard, but they gave her the respect that had been delayed for too long. Charles knew the acknowledgement mattered, because a private apology could heal a family wound, but an institutional correction could protect the monarchy from repeating it. Anne accepted his words without ceremony. She did not soften into victory, and she did not turn the moment into punishment. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter as a mark of senior royal status, showed exactly why her loyalty had always been so difficult for others to understand. Anne had never fought for attention. She had fought for order. She had never warned the family to raise herself above it. She had warned them, because duty meant speaking when silence felt easier. Camilla's position was not destroyed, but it was clearly redefined. The queen consort remained within the royal structure, yet the boundaries Anne had demanded years earlier now stood firm around access, influence, and household decisions. Camilla had survived the storm, but she could no longer move through the same blurred spaces with the same quiet ease. That was the true consequence. Not humiliation for its own sake, but limits, where limits should have existed all along. William and Catherine emerged from the crisis with a sharper understanding of the future they would inherit. The prince saw that uncomfortable truth must be heard before crisis forces it open. Catherine understood that kindness without boundaries can become weakness, and that loyalty sometimes arrives in the form of the person brave enough to object. Together, they carried Anne's lesson forward. Anne's vindication proved something the monarchy could no longer ignore. Loyalty is not always gentle, silence is not always peace, and the crown is safest when someone brave enough dares to warn it. This chapter closes with Anne standing exactly where she had always stood, not above the monarchy, not outside it, but guarding it with the kind of courage only history finally understood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.